He thought he was making his home safer just installing a smart lock on his own pool fence. But within minutes, his quiet afternoon turned into chaos. A neighbor's son, fueled by entitlement and suspicion, dialed 911, claiming he was trespassing on his own property. The flashing lights, the officers, the stares. It wasn't about a lock anymore. It was about race, power, and a dangerous assumption that nearly spiraled out of control. How does a simple act of protecting your home turn into a fight for dignity, safety, and truth? It was supposed to be just another Saturday, the kind of day where the sun shines a little brighter, the chores feel lighter, and life seems almost normal. For Marcus, that meant finally tackling the small projects around his home he had put off all week. He was proud of his house, a modest place in a suburban neighborhood, tucked behind a pool fence he had built with his own hands. It wasn't flashy, but it was his, and every nail, every coat of paint, carried his hard work. Marcus valued peace. After years of juggling 2 jobs, long commutes, and endless bills, he finally had a space that felt safe. His backyard was his sanctuary. The pool, though small, was where his nieces and nephews laughed in the summer, where he cooled off after mowing the lawn, where barbecues turned into memories. But as much as he loved it, Marcus knew safety mattered. The neighborhood wasn't bad, but stories traveled. Strange cars circling streets, packages disappearing off porches. He wanted to be proactive, not paranoid. So, when he decided to install a smart lock on the pool fence, it wasn't about luxury, it was about responsibility. He wanted control, knowing his space was secure, especially when children came over. To him, it was just another improvement, like planting new grass or repainting the deck. To anyone else, it should have been nothing more than a Saturday project. But in this neighborhood, Marcus had learned the smallest things could be twisted into suspicion, because Marcus wasn't just a homeowner. He was a black man in a community where too many eyes seemed to follow him, where too many whispers carried his name. He noticed it in the way some neighbors tightened their grip on their bags when passing him, or how cars slowed when he walked down the street. He brushed it off most days, reminding himself that he had worked hard to earn his place here. He belonged. Still, the air sometimes carried an unspoken tension, one that never quite disappeared. That afternoon, he gathered his tools, set the new lock beside him, and crouched near the fence. It was quiet, except for the buzz of cicadas and the occasional bark of a dog down the street. He liked moments like this, when the world slowed enough for him to think. He thought about his mother, who had always told him, "If you take care of your home will take care of you." He thought about the cookout he wanted to host soon, how proud he'd feel knowing his house looked sharp, secure, and ready for family. But as Marcus worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the first time. In fact, he had noticed it for months. The neighbor across the way, an older woman with a sharp tongue, the type many in the neighborhood privately referred to as Karen, always seemed to find a reason to glance over the fence. Sometimes it was pretending to water her plants for the 3rd time in an hour. Other times, it was lingering by her mailbox long after the mail had been delivered. Marcus tried not to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He told himself it wasn't worth it. Yet deep down, he knew she was waiting for a chance to question him, to challenge his presence, to remind him in her eyes at least that he didn't quite belong. Her son was no better. A grown man who still lived under her roof. He carried the same suspicion in his stare. Marcus had caught him once taking pictures of his car, as if trying to prove some imagined wrongdoing. He had laughed it off, but the memory lingered. This wasn't just about nosy neighbors. It was about something darker, the kind of tension that doesn't stay quiet forever. Still, Marcus pressed on, focusing on the task at hand. The smart lock clicked neatly into place as he adjusted the screws, the sound almost satisfying. He wiped the sweat from his brow, unaware that this simple act was about to ignite something far larger than a home improvement project. Somewhere nearby, a curtain shifted, a pair of eyes narrowed, and a phone was already being pulled from a pocket, fingers dialing 3 numbers that would change the rest of Marcus's day. Marcus didn't know it yet. He thought he was just a man caring for his home. But the truth was, every movement was being judged, every decision weighed against biases he couldn't control. The fence wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a dividing line between belonging and accusation, between safety and suspicion. The day had started ordinary, but ordinary was over. Marcus tightened the last screw and leaned back, admiring the smart lock on his pool gate. It was a small victory, a sign that his home was secure. But he didn't realize that across the street, eyes were locked on him with suspicion. Behind a lace curtain, the neighbor's son watched, his phone already in hand. To him, Marcus wasn't a homeowner, protecting his property. He was an intruder, a problem, a story to spin for the dispatcher on the other end of 911. Within minutes, the air shifted. Marcus didn't hear the call being made, but he felt the weight of silence pressing down on the street. A car passed slowly, the driver rubbernecking at the side of him, kneeling near his fence. Another neighbor lingered too long by their driveway, their gaze sharp. Marcus felt that familiar unease, the one that told him something was about to happen, and then the sound. Sirens, distant at first, then growing louder. His chest tightened. He hadn't done anything he knew he hadn't, but he also knew what sirens meant when someone who looked like him was at the center of the story. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to stay calm, though his heart was racing. The police car turned onto his street, red and blue lights bouncing off the windows of every house. It slowed, then stopped directly in front of his home. Marcus's stomach dropped. Two officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters. Their expressions were guarded, the kind reserved for suspects, not citizens. One scanned the yard, the other locked eyes on Marcus. "Sir," one called out, voice clipped. "We got a call about someone trespassing on this property." The words hung in the air like a trap. Trespassing on his property. Marcus tried to steady his breath, reminding himself to stay composed. "This is my home," he said firmly, gesturing to the house behind him. But the officer's eyes narrowed, skepticism etched into every line of his face. Behind the patrol car, movement caught Marcus's attention. His neighbor Karen stood with her arms folded across her chest, a smug look spreading across her face. And just behind her, her son, the one who had made the call, held his phone high, recording the entire scene like he had orchestrated it. The humiliation burned. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a setup designed to strip Marcus of dignity in front of his own home. The officer stepped closer. "We'll need proof of that. ID. Now." Marcus froze for a moment, weighing his options. He knew the rules. Every movement mattered. Too fast, and he'd look dangerous. Too slow, and they'd read it as defiance. He reached carefully into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, his hands visible the entire time. As he handed over his driver's license, the world around him seemed to shrink. Neighbors had gathered quietly, phones out, whispering. He could feel their judgment pressing against his skin. To them, this was entertainment, not injustice. The officer glanced at the ID, then at Marcus, then back again. "Stay right here," he ordered, walking back to the patrol car. The other officer lingered, hand still near his weapon, eyes never leaving Marcus. Minutes felt like hours. Marcus stood there, heart pounding, sweat sliding down his neck. He wasn't afraid of guilt. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was afraid of perception, afraid that in their eyes, his skin was already the crime. And then, as if the tension wasn't high enough, Karen spoke, loudly, clearly, for everyone to hear. "I told you he didn't belong here. I told you he was up to something." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, rage threatening to spill over. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, to expose her lies. But he bit it back, because he knew one wrong word, one wrong tone, could tilt this entire encounter into disaster. The officer returned, ID still in hand. His expression had shifted slightly, but not enough to erase the suspicion. "It checks out," he said flatly. "This is his property." Relief washed over Marcus, but only for a second, because the neighbor's son scoffed loudly, shaking his head. "Yeah, but how do we know he wasn't trying to break into something? Look at him, messing with the fence like that." The accusation stung deeper than the sirens. It wasn't enough to prove ownership. It wasn't enough to show ID. In their minds, the officers exchanged a look. One nodded. "We'll be keeping an eye on this property," he said. "For now, you're free to go about your business." Free. The word twisted like a knife. Free. As if he had been detained. Free. As if his rights had been suspended until someone else decided to grant them back. As the patrol car pulled away, Marcus stood in the silence of his yard, the smart lock gleaming faintly in the fading sunlight. What should have been a symbol of safety now felt like a reminder of how fragile his peace really was. Across the street, Karen smirked, her son still recording. And Marcus realized the conflict wasn't over. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Because if a smart lock could bring flashing lights to his doorstep, what would happen the next time they decided he didn't belong? Marcus tried to shake off the encounter, but the sting lingered like a burn that wouldn't fade. He went back to his tools, determined not to give the neighbors the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. But every turn of the screwdriver felt heavier, every glance over his shoulder sharper. He could feel Karen's son still watching, still recording. The smart lock wasn't just a device anymore, it was a spark. And sparks, when surrounded by fuel, always caught fire. The next day, the fire erupted. Marcus was finishing some yard work when he heard shouting from across the street. The son was pacing at the edge of his mother's driveway, his phone in his hand, his voice raised. "That man doesn't belong here. He's messing with that fence again." Marcus froze. Again? He wasn't even near the pool gate this time. But before he could react, the sound that haunted him returned. Sirens. Not one car this time. Two. The flashing lights flooded his yard, bouncing across the fence, the house, the carefully cut grass that was supposed to be his sanctuary. Neighbors gathered again, drawn to the spectacle like moths to a flame. Phones rose into the air. Some whispered, others pointed, but all of them watched. Marcus's chest tightened. He hadn't called for this. He hadn't invited this. But here it was again. And he knew that second chances with situations like this were rare. The officers stepped out faster this time. More direct. More aggressive. "Step away from the fence." One barked. His hand was already on his holster. The command wasn't a request, it was an accusation. Marcus raised his hands. Slowly. Palms out. His voice trembled despite his effort to stay steady. "I'm not touching the fence. This is my home." But the words barely mattered. In the eyes of the officers, he wasn't Marcus, the homeowner. He was a problem to be controlled, a threat to be neutralized. "ID," the other officer demanded. Moving closer, Marcus's mind raced. He had already shown them proof yesterday. He had already gone through this humiliating ritual. But he could see it in their eyes. Yesterday didn't count. Yesterday was erased. Today, he had to prove himself all over again. As if ownership expired daily for people who looked like him, he moved slowly, carefully, reaching for his wallet. But before he could even pull it out, Karen's son shouted from the curb, "Watch out! He's reaching for something." The word sliced through the air like a trigger. The officer's stance changed instantly, hand tightening, body tensing, eyes wide with a mix of fear and aggression. The crowd gasped, phones zooming in. Marcus froze mid-motion, his wallet half out of his pocket, his heart pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. He knew this moment. He had seen it replayed on the news, etched into hashtags, carved into memorials. He had seen names, too many names, turned into headlines because someone reached for a wallet, or adjusted a seatbelt, or moved too quickly. For a split second, he thought this was the end. His breath caught, his arms locked. His entire body screamed with the instinct to survive. "I said hands where I can see them," the officer roared. Marcus lifted his arms slowly, the wallet dropping onto the grass at his feet. His entire body trembled, not from guilt, but from the crushing weight of fear and fury colliding inside him. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was defending his right to exist. The crowd buzzed. Phones captured every second. Karen shouted from her yard, her voice dripping with venom. "See? I told you, he doesn't belong here." The officers circled him, tension radiating like heat from their bodies. One bent down, picked up the wallet, flipped it open. Silence. Then, almost anticlimactically. "It's his house." The words were simple, but the moment wasn't. The officers stepped back slightly, but the suspicion didn't leave their eyes. The damage had already been done. Marcus stood in the center of his own yard, his arms still raised, the humiliation seared into him. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't apologize. They just stared, phones still recording, as if waiting for the worst to happen. And that's when Marcus realized something deeper. This wasn't just about a fence. This wasn't about a smart lock. This was about control, about stripping him of ownership, of peace, of the very right to stand on his own land without being treated like a criminal. The officers muttered something about misunderstandings and staying calm, but their words barely registered. Marcus's eyes locked on Karen and her son. They weren't ashamed. They weren't embarrassed. They were satisfied. In their minds, they had won. And maybe in that moment, they had, because Marcus understood the cruel truth. It didn't matter that the ID matched the address. It didn't matter that the officers eventually stepped back. What mattered was that in the eyes of his neighbors, the damage was already permanent. To them, he would always be the man questioned in his own yard, the man nearly branded dangerous for pulling out a wallet. The night closed in, the flashing lights fading, but Marcus's world didn't return to normal. How could it? He had stared down the possibility of becoming another name, another headline, another life cut short for no reason other than perception. The climax of his fear wasn't the wallet falling to the grass. It was the realization that safety in his own home was an illusion. And as he stood there, breath shallow, hands trembling, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the last time. When the police finally left that night, silence fell over the street. But it wasn't peace, it was the kind of silence that weighs heavy, thick with unspoken judgment and lingering fear. Marcus stood in his yard, staring at the lock on the pool gate, the same lock that had sparked chaos. It gleamed under the porch light, a reminder of how something meant for safety had instead invited danger to his doorstep. Neighbors retreated to their homes, doors shutting, curtains falling back into place. Phones were tucked away, videos already spreading beyond the cul-de-sac, tiny fragments of his life reduced to digital fuel for gossip. Karen and her son lingered just long enough to exchange a final smug glance before retreating inside. Satisfied that they had once again controlled the narrative, Marcus remained frozen for a moment, the night air cold against his sweat-soaked shirt. Slowly, he lowered his arms, flexing his fingers as though trying to release the tension still coiled in his muscles. He bent down to pick up his wallet from the grass. That simple object, a thing everyone carried, a symbol of proof and identity now, felt heavier than ever, because he knew it didn't just prove where he lived. It had become his shield. Inside, the house felt different. The walls didn't hum with the same comfort. The pool no longer felt like a refuge. Even the backyard, once his sanctuary, now felt invaded. He sat at the edge of his bed, head in his hands, replaying the scene over and over. The raised voices, the flashing lights, the officer's hand tightening near his holster, the shout he's reaching for something. He thought about how close it had been, how easily the story could have ended with silence and sirens. His name, another headline scrolling across the screen. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking not just about himself but about everyone else who had lived this nightmare before him and those who wouldn't be lucky enough to walk away. Because that's what it was. Luck, not fairness, not justice. Luck. The following days brought whispers, stares, and tension that clung to every corner of the neighborhood. Some neighbors avoided his eyes altogether. Others gave awkward, half-hearted smiles that carried no sincerity. And then there were those who looked at him differently, eyes narrowed, as though wondering what else he might be capable of. The incident hadn't cleared his name. It had stained it. Marcus thought about moving, about packing up everything he had worked for and leaving behind the house he had poured his soul into. But then he thought about his mother's words about how she had fought for her own dignity in a world that didn't hand it over easily. He thought about the fence he had built with his own hands, about the lock he had installed for safety, and about how leaving would mean surrendering something bigger than property. So he stayed, but staying didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending the fear wasn't real or the injustice hadn't happened. It meant carrying it with him. It meant acknowledging that what happened in his yard was part of a larger story, a story woven into the lives of countless black men and women across the country. A story of being questioned in places they belonged, of being doubted no matter how much proof they carried, of being treated as threats first and people second. The incident changed Marcus, but not in the way Karen or her son might have hoped. It sharpened him. It gave him clarity. He realized that silence protected no one, and that dignity wasn't something to be quietly defended but loudly demanded. He began to document his experiences, to speak out, to share his story beyond the confines of his neighborhood. He wasn't just defending his right to exist in his home, he was shining a light on a truth too many tried to ignore. His story wasn't unique. It was a reflection of a cycle that had claimed too many lives, shattered too many families, and scarred too many communities, because racism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through a phone call to 911. Sometimes it smirks from across the street. Sometimes it hides behind the language of suspicion or just doing my job. And sometimes it nearly takes a life not with bullets but with the unbearable weight of humiliation, fear, and constant surveillance. Marcus survived. But the question that haunted him and should haunt all of us was simple. What about the ones who don't? How many more wallets dropped on the ground will it take before we recognize the danger of assumptions? How many more names will echo through hashtags before the silence is broken? How many more times will ordinary lives be interrupted, invaded, endangered before we finally admit that the system isn't broken? It's working exactly as it was built? Marcus's story could have ended differently. It could have ended with a headline, a vigil, another family begging for justice. Instead, it ends here, with him still standing, still fighting, still refusing to be erased. But his survival doesn't erase the injustice. It magnifies it, because if a man can nearly lose his life for installing a lock on his own fence, what does that say about the locks still placed on freedom, on equality, on dignity? And so, the question isn't just what happened